Hello, History 72B Spring Quarter 2023. Take note in both readings and lectures covering the 19th century on of the medicalization of many aspects of human variation, including sexual desire and sexual activities, if not sex itself in the case of women. There are diseases and disorders taken as a matter of fact in other historical contexts that do not exist in our historical context now. And there are residues of diseases and disorders from the 19th and 20th centuries that continue to inform our society now because they seem so natural. And they seem natural because disease, as a full system of explaining bodies, is socially constructed. Now, this doesn't mean that I think cancer or the syphilis bacterium or the COVID virus are not real, quite the reverse. It is the way dominant culture thinks about these when they manifest in human bodies that creates another layer of reality around them, a layer of reality that originated in historically specific ideas and values. For example, a common 21st century American response to cancer is, what unhealthful choices did you make in life that led you to develop cancer? Hysteria is a classic example of this. Hysteria literally is hysteris womb or uterus. So hysteria was thought to be initially, or very, very early on, caused by the wandering of the womb. But even after that, it was considered a female disease caused by being female. I'm not going to talk anymore about hysteria here. It's incredibly easy to find information, correct or not, on hysteria. I suggest searching the library online rather than Google for this one. To go back to assigning individual responsibility for cancer and other disease conditions, syphilis is usually sexually transmitted. So if you have it, it must mean that you have behaved badly, and double the speed of this assumption for people who are not on the high end of vectors of power, people of color, women, and the working class. And as we see now for COVID, there's the idea that the disease caused by the virus is not real, or at least not fatal or debilitating, even in the face of all evidence to the contrary. In addition to diseases that can be traced to clear sources like bacteria or viruses or fungi, or conditions that manifest in mostly seeable or testable ways like cancer, there is now, as there was in the 19th century, an entire realm of diseases and disorders that do not have a clear etiology or cause. There are people whose felt symptoms do not fit easily into completely defined disease states. So they may end up bundled under something like chronic fatigue, or of course, hypochondria. And there are parts of human variability that are not considered disorders in every society, but that are by some groups in 21st century American society. Today, we will be taking on the second of our Sex Among the Victorians quartet. I've called it Psychology in the module title, but I will be talking about more than the field as we think of it now. We are going to work our way to psychology over the course of the lecture so that we can contextualize the emergence of the field. A terminology note before we begin. I'm using the term West at this point in the sense of Western Europe, the United States, and Canada, basically what had been the North Atlantic world. We set the stage in the last lecture by explaining the overall shape of constructions of sex, gender, and race in the 19th century West, and we have been building on understanding of how these became the hegemonic constructions in that particular historical context over pretty much this entire series of lectures so far. Before the period we are looking at currently, in the late 19th century, the meanings of the words sex, gender, sexuality, as we understand them now, was not the same in the historical context we've been looking at, and meaning ran across what we now consider three different words. With this series on the 19th century, sex gender is going to stay a single phrase for a little while longer, but sexuality will be splitting off. I will cover the actual split more in the next lecture. Today, I'm going to set up how human sexual behavior in the West went from being considered physical acts, something that people did that could have religious, social, and legal ramifications, to human behavior understood as the product of desires that find their source in an intangible sense of self and reality that emerges from the physical brain, but is not the same thing as the physical brain. As with the variety of genitals found in humans, the brains and sentience of people did not undergo any significant change in the 19th century. What changed was the way these things were understood, described, and fit into a particular historical context. In Lecture 8, Matter and Mind, Phrenology, Physical Anthropology, and Freud, I'm going to take us from a field that tried to read human character from the very tangible, palpable structures of the human head to a field that explored personality through eliciting information from subjects on the intangible ego stored within the head. Part 1 is the construction of abnormality, pathology, and deviance in the 19th century. Again, as we head into today or into this lecture, I want to be clear that I am not anti-medicine nor anti-psychology. I do want to get us to think about how these fields develop and have morphed through changing historical contexts. We are getting into the period in which homosexuality, or inversion, which actually has a slightly different meaning, was created as a category. Sexual desire and sexual object choice are part of the vast range of human variation, but the way that this variation is grouped, labeled, and valued, or conversely entirely ignored, varies by historical context. We will be looking at the development of sexual object choice as a set of subcategories important to Western power structures from different angles, because it is incredibly important in understanding the history of sex, gender, and sexuality in the US. Building on already constructed categories of sex, gender, what took place in Western culture in the 19th century was along these lines. First, the identification of certain sexual desires or behaviors as wrong, including some nearly universal ones like masturbation or erotic dreams. Some desires and behaviors had certainly been judged wrong before, but the dominant form of enforcement for transgressions of these in Western culture was legal and social judgment, often followed by corporal punishment or marking. For example, in 72A, we saw that Puritan society was organized around a particular construction of family. So for Puritans, any sex outside of marriage was considered a problem that could destabilize society. On the slide here, these are legal notices indicating crime and punishment. Frances Linsford, on the lower one, shared a bed with a man, not her husband, in the absence of her husband, and Alexander Annis, in the above advertisement, abandoned his wife to other temptations and acted as a bawd to her, meaning that he pimped her out. These things occurred in small, tightly knit communities where people knew each other's business, whether they wanted to or not. What was considered destabilizing and forbidden among the Puritans was the act of sex outside of marriage with anyone or anything, because it tended to result in personal grievances that strained social lives and power structures. Between the early modern and Victorian eras, there were massive changes in just about every conceivable aspect of American life, and these were accompanied by changes in what could be destabilizing to power. Over the 19th century, emotions or urges, such as love and desire, became organized first and foremost by the sexual binary in hegemonic culture. For example, emotions and love were associated with women, urges and desires were linked to men. In the 19th century, what was considered destabilizing was anything that threatened the assumption of a strict sex binary and its corollary obligate heterosexual desire. So anything that fell outside of heterosexual desire began to be seen as wrong, and individuals were urged to suppress such desires, or, they were told, their health would suffer. We see this poor character here on the left, same guy in both pictures, here on the left, before the, quote, habits of the secret vice had begun to tell upon him. The secret vice was masturbation. On the right is the same young man 3 years later. He did not give up the secret vice. He looks to me like he might be suffering from an excess of grease paint or bad early sort of airbrushing or Photoshop, but he is clearly in a state of terrible decline because he could not give up masturbation. Sex, gender, sexuality began taking on new forms of importance in the 19th century. The human range of sexual desires did not change with the advent of the 19th century. What did change was the way that Western societies understood and reacted to that variation. When it came to sexual intercourse for a woman, outside of marriage, that was already an act that was legally and socially condemned in hegemonic Western society going into the 19th century. Increasingly, sexual activity between two individuals with penises came to be considered a problem that could destabilize society. Remember, power structures were built on the construction of a strict sex binary and heterosexual marriage. So sexual acts between two people labeled as men was outlawed in many places. But initially, the men involved were not labeled differently to other men. They were men who had engaged in an illegal act. We will explore this potentially more going forward. These are photos of a man arrested for the crime of sodomy in Idaho. And in this case, sodomy means sex with another man. We have also seen in the 19th century the move of science and medicine into the realm of interpreting and shaping social reality and permitted behavior. For example, taking the assumption that all women were passive and all men active, and then tracing the root cause of that distinction to supposed nature. Variability in actual humans that fell outside of the accepted pattern then had to be due to individuals who were exceptions, not to an issue with the basic assumption. If the exceptions clearly threatened or outnumbered the people who benefited from or fit with the assumption, then the problem was still not the assumption. It was that society and people in it were degenerating. Hegemonic 19th century Western society sought ways to eliminate, contain, or punish the exceptions, not to question the basic assumptions of scientists and doctors. The 19th century didn't see a complete changeover from law to medicine. Sex between two unmarried people remained illegal, but medical practitioners became major arbiters of how behavior should be understood. More and more desires and activities, or even bodies, as you see in one of our readings, that lay outside of hegemonic rules about gender, sex, sexuality, became pathologies, diseases, disorders, or deviations. Remember, just like the construction of true womanhood, the construction of normal sexual behavior did not have to do with what actual humans were actually desiring and doing. The point was to control which groups had power over others, and for those groups to maintain power by penalizing those of lower status for not obeying the rules, written or unwritten. The term freak show comes from sideshows at fairs and amusement parks in the 19th century and on that created a space for the general public to scrutinize bodies that were different to their own normal, acceptable bodies. Freak shows provided reassurance to folks who were not at the top of power vectors like class or occupation that they were superior and part of the hegemonic value system because they were not like the freaks. All circus performers were considered freaks to an extent. Physical attributes that we would consider perfectly normal or even admirable now appeared on circus performers, and the sexual morals of circus performers were always a bit suspect. This is Laverie Vallee, who went by Charmian in her circus and then vaudeville acts. She was admired for her muscular development and skills, but She was also not the sort of woman that true women would want to emulate, which made it very clear that true women did not have heavy muscles. In Charmion's most popular vaudeville act, she stripped down to what we would now call a leotard while doing a trapeze routine. Her trapeze performance figured in one of, if not the, first film clips made by Thomas Edison in 1901. And I've given you the link to that under the pop culture bundle. Before we congratulate ourselves on how much progress we've made, because women can be muscular and normal, and we are starting to see a greater variety of bodies on models, let's talk about how much better we are doing now and how far we have come. If you work hard enough, you can achieve anything. But there are a limited number of spaces available. So just as a matter of basic logic, this cannot be true for all people, but it does put the onus on the individual rather than on society. Athletes, especially Black male athletes, are expected to be role models. But oh dear, not like that on the slide. Couldn't they just make charitable donations or build a gym in an inner city or something like that that doesn't make me feel guilty and uncomfortable? Also, your career is over. The coda for this lecture looks more closely at the use of competitive sports as a form of social control. I want to make a big point here before we return to the 19th century. Most people, even people with power in society, rarely recognize that what they are doing is perpetuating vectors of power. That is one reason why cases like the construction of racialized chattel slavery in the early modern Atlantic, or the conceptualization of two incommensurable sexes in the Enlightenment, or the vilification of something called homosexuality in the Victorian era are so important. Those are the historical moments in which at least some people were basically aware that the decisions they were making would hurt other people. This is where we see a tipping point into a set of constructions that will then be elaborated and naturalized over generations. The power of socially constructed systems is that once they're in motion, they seem so natural. This means that both people who benefit from them and people who do not often accept and perpetuate them. When you hear someone say, "That's just how it is," you should start looking for a constructed hierarchical set of categories. Most people perpetuate social constructions most of the time, and all people perpetuate them some of the time without ever realizing it, because people live in their own historical context, in our own historical context. And our historical context is our very meaningful reality with very real consequences affecting us. Now, back to 19th century historical context and consequences. The constructions of sexuality, as it has been understood in my lifetime, meaning prioritizing the sex of our sexual object choice, began to really take shape and solidify in the 19th century. As the sorting and labeling of sexual activities became important in Western culture, that system became reality for the people in it. Many 19th century Westerners genuinely worried that masturbation or contact with a sex worker would make them evil or unclean, or at any rate, something bad and socially unacceptable. You see this clearly in the Ellis reading. For example, the case of the woman who refused marriage offers because she believed that as she had masturbated, she was not a virgin. And as an unmarried non-virgin, she had violated the standard of true womanhood in an unforgivable way. So she was not worthy of marriage. The picture you are looking at shows men negotiating terms with sex workers in 19th century New York City. In the 19th century, medicine and biology developed as fields that served an increasingly important role in defining what was acceptable, called normal, and what could be punishable, labeled abnormal. Acceptable stayed normal. Punishable became not only abnormal, but pathological or diseased. We've seen that biology emerged from the union of physiology and natural history. Natural history had developed strong systems of classification, and this carried into all of the fields that developed within biology. This alone was not necessarily a problem. Organizing, grouping, and categorizing are ways of seeing patterns. But the patterns related to gender, sex, sexuality, or to race were seen by 19th century Western biologists first and foremost through the lens of 19th century Western power structures. Scientists worked to demonstrate that race and sex categories were natural and inevitable, and that the discrete bins or subcategories within them, like male and female for the category sex, reflected reality and mattered in some universal cosmic sense. This slide here is the 1893 Columbian Exposition, one of the world's fairs that were popular among Western nations in the 19th century. This one was in Chicago and is worth an entire lecture of its own, particularly for its white city and for its just within the gates women's pavilion. I may at some point do a coda on it because it's worth discussing the use of science to legitimate categories of sex, race, and nationality. Most scientists almost certainly genuinely believed that what they were doing was observing the world objectively and dispassionately. From the distance of 1 to 2 centuries, it is easier to see how 19th century scholars worked within their particular historical context, whether they were completely accepting hegemonic views or even if they were pushing back against parts of those views. Incidentally, when we look back at why people did the things they did, especially if those things still have ramifications for us now, we do not have to pretend to be dispassionate or objective, but we should probably try to have a clear idea of why we are not dispassionate and how this might affect our interpretations. This image that you are looking at is from 1927, so not quite a third of the way through the 20th century. You can find Albert Einstein and Marie Curie if you look closely enough. Curie is the only woman in the photo, and every single scientist here is white. Some of your readings for this lecture packet are primary sources. That means even if they are saying things that seem familiar for better or worse to us now, when it comes to analyzing those pieces as historical sources, we get the most meaning by considering them in historical context, not to excuse the harmful decisions that they made, but to understand why they thought making those decisions was acceptable. The readings you have were written around 1905, which means that the context they help us to understand, the context which actually shaped them, reflects the constructions built up over the course of the 19th century and going into the 20th. You are looking at Havelock Ellis here on the left and Sigmund Freud on the right. They wrote the primary source pieces you'll be looking at. I try not to burden you with pictures of too many white men who shaped power structures, but since I will be arguing that these two were products of their historical context, I thought it might be useful to see that context manifested in their personal presentation as well as in their work. In the readings, you should notice that Ellis and Freud were both recognizing the reality of the endless variety of human desires and behaviors. But even as they were radically breaking with the scientific opinions of other researchers who reproduced wholesale 19th century hegemonic ideas of sex, gender, sexuality, Ellis and Freud could not get completely away from the social context that they were pushing back against parts of. In the Ellis reading, you should look for how he kept going back and forth between, on the one hand, his observations that masturbation did not actually cause any of the diseases so many of his colleagues claimed, while on the other hand, he kept protesting that he was not approving of masturbation, that it could be done too much, that it could be especially problematic for those with nervous disorders. Both Freud and Ellis recognized that orgasm in women was not some terrible evil, but a normal bodily function. But Freud then went on to know more than women about how they ought to experience orgasm. This brings us to a point I want to make before we head into the next part of the lecture. I am going to critique Freud's construction of the female orgasm fairly harshly near the end of this lecture. Just like I'm not trying to burn all of science or medicine to the ground in these lectures, I am not saying that every idea Freud had was worthless. I am going to say that Freud's construction of female orgasm, as well as his construction of motherhood, was a product of his social context, and that construction was influential enough that it would carry through well past Freud's lifetime. Freud's ideas about female orgasm affected real people who came after him, and it affected them negatively. The point of that is not so much to examine and discard Freud's construction of female sexuality, although I exist in my own social context and you will hear me do just that. The bigger point in including that particular critique of Freud's idea in this series of lectures is to get us to think about how someone who really thought they were only observing reality and who wanted to help people could come up with some ideas that helped some people and other ideas that were disastrous for some people. We are all still welcome to criticize Freud or any other historical actor as we see fit. We will start our story of the head in 19th century science with the whole head and the field of phrenology. A fair number of people now have heard of phrenology, if only because it failed so spectacularly as an actual science. But phrenology emerged from beliefs that existed in the Enlightenment, and it has left a residue on fields like physical anthropology that continued into at least the 20th century and beyond. Phrenology developed from 18th century, meaning 1700s, physiognomy. Physiognomy was the belief that someone's character could be read in their facial features. This is not so bizarre at its most basic level. We tend to make snap assessments of people before we meet them by looking at their faces. Physiognomy took this a step further, or several steps further, and in true Enlightenment style set about systematizing and charting physiognomy, but pretty much without data or sample sizes of more than one. The frontispiece and illustration that you are looking at on the slide come from an English translation of a physiognomy manual that was published in late 18th century Switzerland. My sense is that many upper-class people in the 1700s treated physiognomy the way most people would treat their star sign and horoscope now, something fun to play around with in, oh, I have a nose that shows how intelligent I am, I should have a profile silhouette made, sort of thing. Physiognomy also had a serious side that carried well into the 19th century. You can find a residue of this in early criminology and policing manuals. For example, the idea that police could recognize criminals by features like a low brow or closely set eyes. You can also find a residue of physiognomy in 19th century authors like Charles Dickens when they describe a character's personality by describing their faces. For example, a broad forehead as a sign of honesty. Phrenology transferred the idea of physiognomy from the face to the skull. The concept of reading someone's entire character from the shape of their skull seems quite silly now. But looking a bit closer, we see that the initial idea of phrenology makes some sense in historical context, and the rise and fall of phrenology can tell us a great deal about 19th century beliefs regarding sex gender. The original idea for phrenology came from Franz Joseph Gall, a neuroanatomist in Austria. When Gall was in medical school, he noticed that nearly all of his fellow students who did particularly well had prominent eyes. Scientists knew that people who lost specific parts of their brain in accidents and those who didn't immediately die also lost certain physical functions. Speech was and is a fairly obvious example of this. Gall and his students made the rather radical claim that the mind was the organ of the brain. Mind and brain were not the same. One rose from the other, like violin music from a violin. This probably does not seem radical to you now, but consider context. The underlying philosophy of the Enlightenment was that the answer to everything could be found by studying nature. This was already actually quite a big step for Europeans to take because previously they had believed that all things took their form from God, and it was not for humans to know the mind of God. You might think that if scientists were now invoking nature, this could be interpreted as turning away from God. And some people did see it that way, and they either liked Enlightenment philosophy more or hated it, depending on their personal level and type of religiosity. However, the Enlightenment did not usher in a period of atheism. Most Enlightenment scientists believed that there was just an extra step in there. God created nature and set it in motion, so studying nature was a way of showing appreciation to God for creation. In the 19th century, the major remaining vestige of the direct creation model lay in the body-spirit division. Europeans felt that the human ability to think and worry and judge between good and bad must surely set humans apart from all else in nature. Even if the physical body really was not so different from other animals, the spirit or the soul must surely set humans apart and above. Over the course of the Enlightenment, the soul became seated in the intangible mind. This was the special essence that God had given to man and to no other creature. And here were Gall and his students saying that the mind was directly the product of a physical organ, the brain. The part of Gall's hypothesis that lay closest to modern scientific understanding, that the brain produces thought, was the part that most people in the 19th century thoroughly disliked. And had that been his only contribution, he probably would have been quickly forgotten. But that wasn't all that he proposed. And his other idea, the one that seems so silly to us now, is the one that gained the most popularity in the 19th century. Gall's idea was that since the skull is malleable at birth and hardens completely only in adulthood, it must reflect the shape of the brain inside. And if the brain had localized areas for functions like speech, then why not the faculties that could make up a person's character? Things like sex drive or love of children. The initial idea, again, is not that unreasonable in context. It is, in many ways, analogous to the late 20th century popular idea that there must be a gene for everything. Seriously, everything. People proposed things like a gene for liking pink, or a gene for being better at detecting if your sexual partner was cheating. In other words, things that tell us more about American society in the late 20th century than they do about genetics. Phrenology did not stand up to actual scientific testing and was designated a pseudoscience by the early 20th century. But before that time, it was incredibly popular in the United States. At the height of phrenology's popularity, prison wardens would call in phrenologists to study the skull of a condemned person, looking for a bump or combination of bumps that could be used to describe the criminal type. For example, a bump showing a propensity to violence combined with lack of the bump for self-control. The full phrenological results from examination of the head of the condemned, giving a reading of the complete character of the criminal as judged from feeling and measuring their heads, would then be published in newspapers. And members of the public would be annoyed if they did not find such a report after an execution. Phrenology is particularly informative to us as historians of gender, sex, and sexuality. Phrenologists differed, but the field eventually ended up recognizing around 37 faculties or characteristics that could be read directly from the skull. Given what we already know about hegemonic Western culture in the 19th century and the insistence on a sharp sex binary, we would expect to see phrenology address this issue. And given how powerful the insistence on a sex binary was, we would probably hypothesize that phrenology would reinforce rather than challenging the sex binary. And that is, in fact, what we do see. Phrenologists claimed that an entire pattern of differences showed the distinction between men and women. Phrenologists determined that men had large bumps for amativeness, children had small ones, and women had just right ones, closer to children, but just big enough that a wife would engage in sex with her husband and no one else. So amativeness is physical attraction or love. Women had long, thin necks because their cerebella were smaller than men's. This is according to the ideas of the time. Because women's, and I should add here white women's, interest in sexual love stayed closer to that of children. The bust on the left with the large amativeness bump is Aaron Burr. The woman with the appropriately small amativeness bump is Miss Modesty, and amativeness is labeled on the chart to the right. I could not find philoprogenitiveness on this chart, but there is apparently a bump for it. Philoprogenitiveness is the love of children. In the picture you are looking at on the left, the man knew the woman he married would be a good wife and mother because of her balance of amativeness and philoprogenitiveness. Other features were supposed to differ by sex as well. For example, aggression was assumed to be well developed in males. Females were expected to be largely devoid of aggression, but high in adhesiveness or attachment to surrounding objects, animate and inanimate. You can see that in the picture on the right, in which the boy is breaking everything and the girl is crying. Their aggression made boys choose toys like drums and whips, while girls chose dolls. But boys could not be entirely devoid of adhesiveness because they liked dogs and horses and presumably did not kill them all. So boys must have a small bump for adhesiveness because they liked animals, and because they had a small bump for adhesiveness, they liked animals. This brings us back to the type of circular arguments we have seen before. B exists because of A, but A exists because of B, which is one way historians can use phrenological texts and illustrations to understand not just that hegemonic 19th century American ideals claimed that men and women were entirely distinct, but that they believed that the difference formed even for personality traits from early childhood. Some claims, such as the aggressiveness difference, easily became self-fulfilling. Girls were expected to be more passive and docile, so when little girls showed any sign of aggressiveness, they were punished more severely and more frequently than boys were. In girls, such a trait would be unnatural and must be nipped in the bud if the girl child were to have any chance or hope of a normal adult life. In boys, boys will be boys, am I right? Men and women were also expected, both in phrenology and in hegemonic thought, to have different intellectual abilities. For example, claims that there was, quote, less vigor in the female intellect were used by opponents of education for women. 19th century scientists made claims along the lines of, women do not extend their reasoning beyond the range of the visible world, nor do they make any great or daring excursions into the region of fancy, which is interesting, given that we saw in the last lecture that women's perceptions of their own sexual sensations could not be trusted because so many women are apt to imagination. This sort of inconsistency could be reconciled by claiming that clearly fancy and imagination were very different things, and just as clearly fancy, the male-associated one, was the superior of the two. Examination of phrenology's treatment of supposed sex-based intellectual differences early versus late in the 19th century reveals an interesting shift. If you think about the way I have described phrenology so far, it was basically a biology is destiny sort of thing. You could tell a little boy or girl will grow up to be a criminal by reading the bumps on their head. In the first half of the 19th century, however, many phrenologists read a propensity toward rather than a definite future. Little John or Susie might have a natural propensity toward criminal behavior, but if it was caught early and the child raised correctly, disaster could be averted. This same sort of optimism held for differential intelligence as well. People could find out where their natural talents and weaknesses lay. They could develop their talents fully and at least lessen their weaknesses through exercising those skills, quite like building stronger muscles through exercise. High-profile American phrenologists often actually supported women's acceptance to medical schools, on the grounds that women's natural empathy, combined with training up the weaker logical areas of the brain, would make them, quote, capital doctors. This is one place where phrenologists actually pushed back against a small set of hegemonic ideas. Most male scientists, doctors, and educators opposed a medical education for women. You might recall that in the first half of the 19th century, the urge to reform society was still linked more closely to the idea of millennialism, the literal or metaphorical end of times. It was each person's individual duty to improve themselves for the good of society as a whole. Phrenology fit that model in the first half of the century. By the late 19th century, most scientists doubled down on the biology as destiny side of things. In their view, the lives of human beings were governed by the, quote, tyranny of their organization. Note that both mainstream science and phrenology agreed that on the you are a woman and hence by nature different part of things. But phrenologists then went on with, you must express the gifts you have even beyond the household. Hegemonic science by the late 19th century partnered the you are a woman and therefore different with your differences disqualify you for the worldly roles you seem most unwisely to wish to assume. That last part is a quote. I put it on the slide. I will note also here that phrenologists often came from lower classes, working classes, whereas hegemonic scientists came from at least the educated elite, if not the financial elite. The more women pursued higher education in male-coded fields like biology and medicine, the more men in those fields pushed back, but always with the veneer of science and true concern for women. Usually something along the lines of, women could be trained in critical thought, but because their brains were naturally weaker, most women would just end up making themselves ill. There might be some exceptional individual women, but they were exceptional and thus proved how different men and women really were rather than threatening the binary. The educated woman, like the sexually ambiguous body, became the exception that proved the rule, as long as too many women didn't break the no higher education rule, which they were wont to try to do. In the first half of the 19th century, phrenologists and scientists both saw self-improvement for everyone as a route to social improvement. Most late 19th century scientists did not see the world that way anymore, which meant that they made different recommendations for improving society, specifically for us, American society. These scientists held on to the idea that biology pretty much equaled destiny and that variation between people should be organized by a hierarchical ranking of better and worse, the residue of the great chain of being. Some 19th century scientists argued that if individuals could not substantially improve themselves, and that's what they were saying, then society would not benefit by encouraging or helping individuals. The only way that society could improve in this view was to weed out the individuals judged to be inferior. We will discuss this more in a lecture coming up when we get to eugenics. Phrenology died out, but its basic premise lived on, namely that measuring skulls could tell scientists something meaningful about people. But by the late 19th century, the premises and techniques of skull measurement developed in the context of hegemonic scientific belief that a person's abilities were basically set at birth and could only be developed marginally beyond that. The branch of science that combined reading the skull with determining and charting innate differences between people was physical anthropology. Physical anthropologists, unlike phrenologists, had all the prestige of science and high personal social status in the latter half of the 19th century. And unlike phrenologists who focused on reading and interpreting individuals, physical anthropologists were interested in making generalizations about groups, especially groups of sex and race. Many physical anthropologists turned their techniques and prestige to demonstrating that there were fundamental and meaningful differences between the sexes, and so a solid sex binary must reflect nature and not social values. And Most early physical anthropologists also specifically set out with the idea that they would study the differences between the races and, this is a quote again, explain why all but the white race were inferior. In 1859, Paul Broca founded the Anthropological Society of Paris. You might recognize Broca's name from the part of the brain responsible for speech. The Anthropological Society of Paris became the center of racial typology in Europe. Anthropological societies in England, Germany, and Italy all emulated and connected themselves to Broca's original society. Broca asserted that there was an unequal degree of perfectibility among races. Just as with sex, the racial typology system only worked if all of the features that physical anthropologists ascribed to a particular race were linked and inseparable. The results of sexual relationships between actual humans and actual reality already showed that this was not the case. While a society that has been geographically isolated might develop several common features in higher percentages than in other isolated groups, once these groups ceased to be isolated and joined the greater human population, it always became obvious that traits, physical and behavioral, were quite independent, meaning separable from one another. To make this more concrete, in the American South prior to the Civil War, which ended in 1865, there was frequent sexual contact between male enslavers and enslaved women. No one was blind to the fact that differing combinations of hair texture, skin tone, and facial features appeared among the children who resulted. Traits are not linked into predictable suites of characteristics that can be used to reliably distinguish races. Nonetheless, 19th century physical anthropologists insisted that there were pure racial types, each of which could be identified by a unique, fundamentally hereditary group of linked traits. These physical anthropologists claimed that so-called pure racial types or archetypes should be considered timeless and changeless, even as the anthropologists failed to locate actual living examples of archetypes. Physical anthropologists of the late 19th century admitted that there might be some blurring where populations met, but in the minds of early physical anthropologists, the essence of each separate race remained pure. Now, what this meant when you mixed races, which essence overcame which, had more to do with ideas of purity and pollution than it did with biology. On the left, you have the 18th century physiognomy chart linking nose shape to social class and character that you saw earlier in this lecture. On the right is a 19th century chart linking nose shape and race. The details may vary, but the charts share the same organization, as well as the goal of distinguishing superior humans from all others. This is one of those historical tipping points in which motivation, the realization of consequences to others, and commitment to a certain social construction are extremely clear. 19th century physical anthropologists built on ideas of race that we have already seen formed in the Atlantic world, including the Chesapeake region of the US. But these early physical anthropologists intentionally sought to refresh and strengthen the constructions of race and put the weight of their scientific credentials behind a differential valuation of people based on this construction of race. Lest you think I am making too strong a claim here, the founder of the Anthropological Society of London created his organization to counter claims of the Ethnological Society of basic human equality and unity. Ethnologists study culture, and they were not saying that every human was identical. Moreover, these particular ethnologists were also enmeshed in the historical context of late 19th century England, so they were in no way free from racist and nationalistic constructions of their historical context. Nevertheless, the founder of the Anthropological Society of London felt that the ethnologists were too keen on the whole universal human thing. He said that he founded the Anthropological Society of London to, quote, show that human equality is one of the most unwarrantable assumptions ever invented by man. And I put that quote on the slide. The fact that constructed categories of race were flexible and that they reflected claims of power by Europeans and Euro-Americans rather than arising from any observation of nature can be seen in some of the subcategories used. For example, Polynesians, Chinese, and Celts were all at one point or another proposed as complete separate races as European imperial powers and the United States expanded their geographic reach. If you don't know already, Celtic society is usually defined by language. The Irish, who speak Gaelic, are and were in the 19th century considered Celts. The English held Ireland in the 19th century, and many Irish immigrants came to the U.S. to escape violence and famine. Power systems in both England and the United States had a vested interest in keeping the proposed Celtic racial group in a subordinate position. Likewise, in the 19th century, the European powers were competing to claim colonies in Africa. In the United States, after the 13th Amendment abolishing enslavement, racial typology focused on constructing a cohesive race that would include any individual who could be shown through family trees to have any African ancestry. Before the 13th Amendment, the U.S. Constitution ended slavery. This racial typology was used to justify the enslavement of fellow humans, but was actually more flexible towards individuals with mainly European ancestry. After the 13th Amendment, an even more strict racial typology was used to justify keeping freed people and their descendants from obtaining practical, as opposed to on paper legal, equality. And you'll hear this referred to as the one-drop rule. While European societies placed the so-called Negroid race at the bottom of their typologies, what became known as the American School of Physical Anthropology was recognized to be the most insistent on this ordering, even more so than the European societies. Gender sex constructions were built into racial typologies. We already know that women of color and poor women were a priori excluded from true womanhood. 19th century physical anthropologists claimed that women were fundamentally different to men, inferior and less intelligent. These physical anthropologists grouped women, children, and all races other than Caucasian together and separated them from white men. White male children would continue to mature past childhood, but everyone else in the group was supposedly stuck irrevocably at the level of white male children. These are the least worst cartoons I could find from the 19th century, showing the concept of the United States as the benefactor and savior of helpless women and children, basically casting all other countries as either children or desperate, helpless women. The Christmas tree cartoon on the left also shows Colombia, and you might consider the whole white women as a civilizing influence, but not suited to governing thing. A book summarizing 19th century hegemonic ideas about sex gender, appropriately titled Man and Woman, was published in 1894. The author of that book was Havelock Ellis, the author of a primary source paper on masturbation that you have in this lecture packet. Coming full circle, you can see in your reading that Ellis pushed back against many claims of the science of his time. At various points in that paper, he argued that individuals who preferred same-sex encounters should not be classed as defective psychological cases, that women not only had sexual feelings, but that they were actually capable of eliciting sexual pleasure through masturbation. And finally, that masturbation would not cause a whole host of disease states, although he frequently qualified that last claim. Ellis also wrote an entire influential book summarizing all the available data that purported to show that women were substantially different from and inferior to men. Your second primary source paper is by Freud, whose name is pretty much synonymous with the first clear articulation of theory for the field of psychology. In the piece that you have, Freud took great pains to demonstrate that, in the language of the day, inverts were not degenerates. In other words, Freud was arguing that homosexuals were not any more likely to be abnormal or pathological than any other set of ordinary people grouped together. Freud formed his theories of psychology based on actual interviews with actual people. But he then extrapolated from his own historical context to all people ever. He came up with the influential theory of bisexuality. Now, pay attention here. Freud did not mean what we mean by bisexuality. His definition was not applied to sexual object choice, but to the idea that everyone had some male and some female characteristics. Freud also came up with things like castration anxiety and penis envy, and he hypothesized that they were common to all humans ever. Rather than considering how some of the traits he described might be direct outgrowths of his own historical context, he claimed that they were universal traits that divided all women from all men, despite the overlap of traits that he suggested with his own theory of bisexuality. If you are someone who listens to these lectures, particularly if you manage to get to this stage not thinking that the penis was the center of all human experience, this is a slide I recommend looking at. I recommend the work of Jonathan Ned Katz to everyone, and I have a quote from Katz on the slide. Freud was one of the most influential scientists to oppose the idea of passionlessness in women. But he also espoused the idea that the mature form of orgasm in women was vaginal and did not involve at all the clitoris. This is an example of historical context and residue causing a scientist to go through incredible logical contortions. I won't explain all of those here for Freud's two-stage female orgasm. But I want to give enough so that you could see some of the constructions we've talked about before at play. Despite the fact that Freud pushed many envelopes, Freud inherited the Enlightenment idea of two incommensurable sexes. He would defend inverts as not outside the realm of human variation, but he also believed that heterosexuality was the ideal state in humans, and that inversion or homosexuality resulted from something that went wrong in childhood, like an unresolved Oedipal complex, which could, of course, be blamed on the mother. As a believer in two separate sexes, Freud was committed to finding differences, but he also argued that libido or sexual desire was common to all humans, regardless of sex. In order to reconcile the sameness of libido with the supposed inherent difference of male and female, Freud basically went back to some of the one-sex ideas dating to before the Enlightenment, when anatomists saw both the vagina and the clitoris as the analogs of the penis. Despite literally thousands of years in which people knew that clitoral stimulation led to female orgasm, Freud claimed that women who had what he designated clitoral orgasms were arrested in a childhood state of sexual development, that they were sexually immature or stunted. According to Freud, as girls matured into women, the locus of pleasure should move to the opening of the vagina. Freud called this the vaginal orgasm. The choices on the slide here are all fairly recent. I chose them to show how much effect Freud's incorrect theory still has. Note that the question posed, and certainly the main concern, is really, are you being a woman correctly? Not, tell me what you personally like with your individual body so that I can make you happy. There was a great deal in this two-orgasm model of female development that reflected Freud's society. For example, females would inevitably be traumatized by the realization that they had a, quote, space of emptiness rather than the penis of a man, and that the penis must be absolutely central to women's sexual desires and experiences. What did not appear in Freud's two-female orgasm model was anything solid in the way of anatomical, physical, or neurological evidence for immature versus mature female orgasms. Nevertheless, Freud's influence was such that generations of women believed that they were psychologically damaged and stuck in a state of immature sexual development because They did not experience the transition to vaginal orgasm as Freud described it, since he experienced it surely with his own vagina. I chose that particular example because it shows just how powerful a social construction, once set in motion, can be. Women in the late 20th century, that would be the late 1900s, nearly a century after Freud, were still writing to advice columnists and going to psychologists to fix their sexual problem. And advice columnists and psychologists right through the late 20th century gave these women strategies for overcoming this developmental sexual problem, rather than saying that there was no problem at all if women experienced orgasm through clitoral stimulation as adults. The biggest pushback against the two-stage female orgasm came from feminists. The article that you are looking at by journalist Susan Leiden was published in 1975. You can see from the title that she was trying to reassure women that there was nothing wrong with them if they did not conform to Freud's deeply flawed model. The situation reminds me of Rousseau's instructions in the Enlightenment on how women should not just behave, but be. Women are natural mothers, but they also are generally incapable, so they need me to tell them how to mother correctly. Here we have Freud. Sure, women can have sexual pleasure, but they are also generally incapable, so they need me to tell them how to correctly orgasm. Key points for Lecture 13. Sexuality came to be associated with sexual object choice in the 19th century. 19th century scientists in a variety of fields devoted their research to proving that there were two and only two distinct sexes. Individuals with not just bodies but behaviors that did not conform to distinct 19th century gender roles were interpreted as deviations or exceptions, not as challenges to the two discrete sexes model. Once put in motion, social constructions become extremely powerful because they seem natural and are, in historical context, normal. Social constructions are built on ideas that came before, even if they oppose some part of those ideas. Most people perpetuate social constructions without ever realizing it, even if they suffer rather than benefit from those constructions. There are historical tipping points in which at least some people with power have an awareness that the claims they are making will harm some people. The 19th century saw the development of three new professional fields, two of which still exist in modified form now: phrenology, physical anthropology, and psychology. And obviously the latter two are the ones that still exist. Phrenology, based in the idea that different aspects of a person's character developed in specific regions of the brain. The state of development for each character trait could be determined by taking various measurements of a person's head. Although popular in the 19th century, phrenology died out by the early 20th century. Phrenology was structured to support the two-sex model. In the first half of the 19th century, phrenological readings were used to help people improve themselves individually for the good of society, especially in the US. By the late 19th century, the biology as destiny attitude had become more firmly entrenched, and scientists believed that people could do very little to improve or change themselves after birth. Physical anthropology took the idea from phrenology that different measurements of skulls would reveal meaningful information about a person, or, more to the point for physical anthropologists, a group of people. Quite specifically and deliberately, physical anthropology used this idea to make claims that different races had different essences. You'll recognize essences in essentialism. Among the races, 19th century physical anthropologists described Caucasians, by which they meant people socially designated as white in Western culture, as always superior. The claims by 19th century physical anthropologists were used to adapt justifications for colonization and enslavement of humans to the new scientific Victorian world. Psychology still pushed the two-sex model, although theories were formed from interview data on thoughts rather than from physical measurements. Freud argued against most of his colleagues that inverts or homosexuals were not inferior pathological people. Freud observed that female sexual arousal and orgasm were perfectly normal, but he also suggested that women who continued to have clitoral rather than vaginal orgasms in adulthood were in a state of arrested or stunted sexual development. So far in this module, I have been focusing on how the middle and upper classes formed hegemonic ideas of gender, sex, sexuality, and race. In the next lecture, we will be looking at how Americans outside of the higher classes navigated hegemonic scientific theory and power systems in their daily lives. This coda is not super tight quite yet, but it's connecting some of the lecture to what we see now, especially in the field of sports and fitness. What you see here is that you have to win. I'm reading the slide now. There's only one difference between the winning and the losing team. The winner wants it more. The only one who can tell you you can't win is you, and you don't have to listen. Success is no accident. It is hard work, perseverance, learning, studying, sacrifice, and most of all, love of what you are doing or learning to do. In life, there is no such thing as impossible. It's always possible. You can get there, and one day it will come true. Realistically, I can want a whole lot of things that I cannot have, no matter how much I want them or how much I study them. The reality for elite athletes is that there are very few of them, and they can be very admired. They are also going to lose more often than they win if there can only ever be one winner. This is tightly connected with sex gender. So again, I'm reading advertisements on the slide. When you feel like quitting, remember why you started. Giving up is not an option. We are limited only by our dreams. Failure's not an option. Giving up is simply not an option. Failure in sports, how to avoid it and how to deal with it when it happens. There are only a few spaces available. Why wouldn't you quit if you were training for an elite position and clearly not going to get one? People give lip service to, oh, no, I'm only doing it purely for the love of the sport. Yeah, not buying it. The reality of what it takes to become an elite athlete, here I've focused on Olympic athletes, but this is true in all high status sports. It takes starting early. It takes money. It takes living in an area where you can get training that you want. And now it takes a great deal of science and technology. Running shoes, the optimal position to take off for a sprint or a dive, tennis rackets. Is that natural superiority? Why are some things allowed and other things not? We, as a society, ask a phenomenal amount of our athletes. We ask them to keep breaking records. We ask them to devote their entire lives to their sport. And then we say, well, you can alter your bodies in some ways, but not in others. No taking that. No smoking dope. None of that. So now getting to the effect of elite athletes on regular people. You could just say, well, that's only a handful of elite athletes. It's not going to affect everyone else, except, yeah, it does. And also, the idea that the whole point in separating male and female sports is because otherwise it would not be fair. Now, leaving aside for a moment, the sports that we have are not the only possible sports when it comes to activity. Competition is not the only way to enjoy physical play. In what universe is it fair that some basketball players are successful because they're so much taller than ordinary people? I have nothing against it. I don't really care. But the reality is that's not fair. And yet all men are somehow touched with the brush of superiority by this small group of incredibly elite men. I would also like to point out that if you look back at the don't quit, you can win, you can do whatever you want. The traits that are stressed include, and I'm going to read these off of something on the slide that's going in a different direction, determination, perfectionism, obsession, and competitiveness, which are common to clinical patients with eating disorders. So in other words, what makes you a great athlete can also make you ill. There may be a lot of losing in the way to success or failure. The entire purpose still comes down to competition and winning, bragging rights, if you will. This feeds into also the gender dimension in elite athletics. And here again, I focus on the Olympics. Abercrombie and Fitch ran a shirt that said L is for loser during the Summer Olympics one year. And I have a picture of that here. There is also this ad. A loser says that's the way it's always been done. A winner says there ought to be a better way. I think that there are many things that can be done in better ways, but not so much for self-aggrandizement. In terms of gender differentiation, boys in the US are not encouraged to do gymnastics or to dance, which is a pity. I can attest to buying clothing for a boy who did gymnastics and dance and having someone say to me, I would not let any son of mine wear that. The fact that the L for loser on this shirt is a male gymnast is no accident. But at the same time, many, many, many little girls are enrolled in gymnastics because that is coded as feminine in the US. And most female athletes get more coverage if they are popularly judged to be attractive. It's not news that a society organized around selling tends to cater to the male gaze, at least ours, and that this generally sexualizes women. These on the slide are only some of the Olympic athletes who have figured in the SIP swimsuit issue, and that's has traditionally always been all women. So, do I feel empowered as a woman by women winning? Well, not really. That's not me winning, nor will it ever be me winning. But I am affected by the idea that I, as a woman, am constantly judged as not within this range on this slide, and that therefore I am less than. Already less than a man, now less than other women, although those women are often treated as if they have no brains once they've done a Sports Illustrated shoot. Now, you could say, well, that's just Sports Illustrated. I'm just going to say, no. This on the left, lower left there, is the Norwegian volleyball team. They were fined for wearing what they are wearing in those pictures, cropped bra tops and tight biking style shorts, because they didn't reveal enough skin. And you can't tell me that it enhances performance, because on the lower right, those are the men's outfits. And you can't tell me, when it is so easy to find these shots, like the one on the upper right, that it is about something other than the male gaze. But now going back to phrenology, I should have realized, but did not, that many modern phrases trace their roots to phrenology, including highbrow and lowbrow, well-rounded, and shrink.